Hello, YouTubers. So today's video is going to be focused on multi-cluster. And so when we talk about multi-cluster, specifically this is for OpenShift Multi-Cluster. So next week, going to be dropping a preview on OpenShift Multi-Cluster. And let's talk a little bit about what that means. There are multiple phases, and I believe that I'm probably going to create multiple videos, multiple demos. So let's talk a little bit about what this first video demo is going to be about, and we'll progress from there. So the first demo is OpenShift Multi-Cluster. This is not focused on Kubernetes just yet. This is 100% focused on OpenShift. And in this environment, this is what I call a standalone deployment. And this is like the simplest. Standalone deployment using a non-secure route with NodePort. And again, let's just get the concepts and then we'll build on these demos. So the purpose here is to front end or gateway multiple clusters and have big IP load balance traffic between the two clusters. So let's take a look. So as you can see, I have a big IP that is front ending or that is steering traffic to an OpenShift 4.11 cluster and a brand new cluster of OpenShift 4.13, which I've actually just installed a couple days ago. Now, my primary, or if you want to call it my production cluster, the trusted cluster, that's where I've been running my applications all this time, is 4.11. However, I want to move 4.11 to 4.13, or I want to upgrade that cluster, but I don't want to take the apps down, or I want to have my applications running in 4.13 for a period of time, maybe a month, before I do anything with this cluster. Or it's kind of nice to have two different clusters. Maybe I want to put a different version of app here. There are many different ways, but what this is providing us is traffic splitting, maybe a little bit of kind of like A/B type deployment, but great for high availability, resilience, being able to allow developers or the administrators to work on a cluster without actually disrupting traffic. And what CIS does is automate that entire process, potentially. So let's take a look. So I have two OpenShift clusters. Here's my first cluster. This is a 4.11 cluster. And my second cluster is a brand new 4.13 cluster, just been installed. And so as you can see, two OpenShift clusters that I've provisioned in my infrastructure. And here is my big IP gateway that is sitting in front of those two clusters right now. There's no traffic policy steering traffic into the cluster. So right now, I cannot get into the cluster. So there's no public IP here. So in standalone mode, and again, this demo is focused standalone. In this environment, we only have one CIS, and the CIS in this instance is running in the 4.11 cluster. Yes, can I do active-active? It's coming in the up-and-coming demo. Or active standby, it's coming. Probably next week I'll release that demo. And so with my two environments we talked about, one thing that's really important is that we have similar pods in both the clusters. So if I go to the first cluster and if I go down to the workload and if I actually look at the pods that are running here, you can see for Cafe 1, there are similar types of pods. So let's just look at the deployment. You can see there are 5, 3, and 3. That's just kind of how it deployed, right? And if I look at my second cluster, if I look at my deployment, in this case, it's 3, 3, and 3. And that's actually okay. But the thing here is that within the cluster, the applications are similar. And so the coffee pod and tea pod, they're of the same deployment type. How many deployments, or actually how many pods you have, doesn't really matter, as long as the deployment is the same. And that's really important. So the service has to be identical, other than some names, and the deployment other than potentially the names. Those need to be identical. So it's the same, ultimately, image. And that's really what's important here. The other thing is that you need to be aware of is that we're networking here. So this is NodePort. So in NodePort, my networks are unique. When I do cluster IP, which is next, I'm going to have to make sure that my pod networks are different. Or it's going to cause a problem potentially. And so that's the next demo that I'm going to do. I'm going to do a standalone deployment with cluster IP. So I can kind of show the differences where kind of like big IP sending traffic not to kube proxy, but directly to the pod. But I wanted to kind of just get this started. So very important that I'm distributing traffic between the two clusters. Now, how does CIS monitor or access the informers or the services with the remote cluster or the external cluster? And this is what's really important. CIS has to be able to read the information. And what CIS does is it uses kubeclient to do that. And so we have to share some information from the remote cluster to the 411 cluster so CIS can read it. So we have to fetch the kube config for the config map from the external cluster. That's really important. So we got this config map. It will fetch the kube config for the config map for the external cluster, and then it will subscribe to those informers using this kube config or kube client ultimately. So it's actually very clean. So, we're not necessarily exposing, I believe, a security risk unless you feel otherwise. I'd love to be able to know your concerns because this is obviously very new. And so to do that, what we're actually doing is I'm actually going to go and copy or move, or if you don't want to move these files, what you could actually do is you could actually go and create them. You could actually just go and import the file. In my case, I copied the kube config from the 413 cluster to the 411 cluster. So I was able to grab the kube config. We know where it is. It's under IPI auth because I did infrastructure provisioning right here. And I copied it over using SCP, copied it over to this cluster right here. And so now this cluster has access to the kube config for the OpenShift 413 cluster, so CIS can access that so it can subscribe to the information. And you can actually see it here. So I copied that over. You can see this is the 413 cluster. You can see there is the kube config for the OpenShift 413, similar to its own kube config. The only difference is this is the remote cluster. And so once I've done that, I can then go and take this kube config and actually create my secrets. So from the kube config, OC create secrets, create this as a name, and then from the file, and that's the file that I copied in there. So there's the local, there's the remote, that's the file name. And what it's done is it's created that secret. And so now here are my two secrets. I don't really need this first one because it's already there, but I just created it just to kind of show you here's the two secrets. So if I wanted to share this one with the other one, I would kind of follow the same process. And so here's the secret that I need to access this. Now, this is really important because I'm going to reference this in what we call our gateway configuration, because this is similar to Gateway API, except that we're not using the Gateway API implementation because it's still alpha. We're actually using an extended config map with our own spec with an OpenShift route. So let's look at that extended config map because that's really important. And so if I go to the 411 cluster and go down to the extended config map, we can bring it up here. And so it's very, very, very simple. Now, this is what's nice about Standalone is that within Standalone, I don't have to specify any HA stuff, right? That will come in the next demo, or I can share the documentation. You guys can configure it next week. But you can see here the only multi-cluster information I need to share is the remote cluster. So share the remote cluster, and of course, there are my secrets. So now I know how to get there. And then this is a extended route spec. So the extended route spec is basically what we call our next-gen routes. And so my namespace, my virtual. So I don't specify the IP in the route or in the CIS controller, I specify the route. Think of it in the gateway configuration. There's a lot that you can do here. You can reference policies, you can reference TLS information. But in my case, I'm just keeping it simple. So the extended config only gets created in the 411 cluster. So let's go back to the diagram. So now that I've created my extended config map and I've created my shared secrets, I can actually go ahead and deploy my instance of CIS. So this is very simple. So just deploy CIS in 4.11. You can actually see here, there's the RBAC, there's the deployment, and in the remote cluster, we need this RBAC file for CIS. So this is just role-based authentication for CIS for the second cluster. And so at this point, I've deployed my extended config map, I've deployed my CIS, and at this point now I can actually go and simply just deploy my applications. So like you've seen the applications running in OpenShift, deployed my applications, and you can actually see if you actually get a service on these apps, you can actually see that there are multiple different ports. Since I've deployed 3 different services, you can see the ports. We might just pick up on coffee, for example. So if I go into the OpenShift cluster and actually go ahead and you can kind of see these. Here is the 411. So if we do a OC get service, and this is Cafe 1, we'll do an enter here. You can kind of see, monitor this port. This is 323.18. And if we do the same in the second cluster, oopsie, let's go ahead and get that. This is OC get service for the second cluster. Here is 3.11.4. Why this is important is because I want to kind of show you how these pool members are populated on BigIP. So right now we don't have a route. So what I want to do next is actually go ahead and create some routes. So let's go to network. You can see right now for this project I have no routes, and same thing for the second cluster. For this project there's no routes, and so that's why there's no public IP on BigIP itself. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create three different routes. We're going to create a route for coffee, mocha, and tea. These are 3 different pods that are running in the service. So we're not going to create the routes in the 413 because there's no CIS. We're only going to create the routes in the 411 cluster. And so I'm going to go ahead and see where I am. Okay, so I'm within here, and I have my non-secure and secure routes. So in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an OC create, and I'm going to create all those 3 routes for non-secure. So these are the 3 routes that I created. Once I've created these 3 routes, I can actually monitor the API. So you can actually see that there's actually posting on the API right here. So this is basically like on my request response. This is the underlying API that I'm actually posting. So I know there's a success there. So these routes were created. So now that my routes are created, I can actually go and select these routes. This is a very simple HTTP route, and I can actually go and open this in a new tab. So here I am opening routes for coffee. So here I'm going to open routes for mocha, and here I'm going to open routes for tea. So as you can see right here that this is coffee. These server addresses are all incrementing. These are different pods getting round robin load balance between the different infrastructures at 10:30, and we can take a look at what this kind of looks like. So I'm actually bouncing between the clusters. So if we go take a look at what this looks like on BigIP, we can actually see now on BigIP I have one virtual because it's all one public IP. This is the public IP that was created. But let's go and take a look at the policies. So within BigIP, we actually create a policy, and we'll have 3 policies here. We'll have one for coffee, mocha, and tea. And you can see they go into it's going to the pool member. So the biggest, probably the most important thing to actually look here is kind of the pools that's important, and you can actually see our pools are actually right here. So now we've got, because this is NodePort, I'm looking at my nodes, and so this first one here is coffee, and let's go and take a look at the coffee app. And so there's actually 12 in here, but what's really important is you see these service ports. So this is all coming from the 411 cluster, and this is all coming from the 413 cluster. So that shows us right there. You can see that this is, you can see that matches the information right here, where that is that service, basically that pod that's been addressed there, and in this one here, that one there is that pod, and it's the same thing for Mocha and T that you can see there. So what CIS did was it picked up the pool members, which are basically, in this case, nodes, and it added them to the big IP public IP pool, if you want to call it. And so these are available endpoints to load balance to. And so now you can continue to connect to your cafe example here on Coffee, Tea, and Pod, and it's just going to continue to load balance the traffic. There's actually a nice way to see this. If I actually go to the network map, you can actually see this quite nicely here on this network map. So you can actually see this is the coffee, and here's actually all the different information that's actually coming in here, which I think is actually kind of cool. You can actually see it. Now, what would be better is when I create the cluster IP, because then what's happening is I'm actually going from big IP directly to the pod itself in the two different clusters. Trust me, that's coming next. I'll record that next week once I create that. So this is kind of like the representation that you can see it right here, and there are some current connections kind of coming in here. It's kind of trickling, but there's a few things here because it's kind of like persistence. If I go look at the big IP, there's a few things here like on kind of like probably there's a cookie in place, and so by default there's probably some cookie in here, and that's basically keeping me kind of stuck to the same server. So yep, there's a cookie there, right? So that's kind of like what I'm going to do. But when you have multiple clients, you're kind of going to get you're going to get sprayed across multiple different endpoints. So that is the demo of OpenShift Multi-Cluster. Now, this is going to be preview code that's going to get published next week. So if this is something that you're interested in testing in, reach out to me or your colleague within F5, and so that I can provide the code to you. If you like this demo, please provide a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Just hit 500 subscribers. The channel's actually growing quite nicely. Let me know if you have any comments. And then again, watch out for the next demo, which is going to be standalone deployment using cluster IP. And then I'll build on that. And ultimately what I'll get to is moving from standalone to doing a active-active where there are two CISs. So CISs are in both clusters, or an active standby where there's still two CISs, but one is active, one is standby. So those are kind of like the different control plane kind of configurations that we'll kind of get to. But let's start with showing you kind of like a standalone deployment using NodePort, supporting OpenShift Multi-Cluster, as you can see in this demo. Thank you very much.